So I wonder, listening to those descriptions of Jesus in chapter 1 of Revelation, if you would, just in one word, just shout it out, if you could reduce to one word your main impression of the description we hear of Jesus in that text, what would it be? What word? Anybody? Awesome. Holy. Overwhelming. Majesty. Glorious. Wonderful words. Excellent. If you're ever driving through Spokane, we hope you'll stop and spend a little money on your way, heading out to Ritzville, you know. But as you're heading out I-90 west, just as you're leaving town, the freeway looks like it's heading right through a church. That's the church I attend. I've been a member there for 35 years. It's First Presbyterian Church. The freeway just takes a little bend to the left and barely misses it. Originally, they planned to build the freeway right through the church and move the church. Some voices rose up in protest at attacking that classic building in Spokane. So anyway, you'll see it there on the right as you're heading west. Well, if you're paying attention, about a half a block before you reach the church, you'll see this mural painted on the side of a brick building in downtown Spokane. This is the view from the freeway. I don't know, I've never been able to figure out who exactly was responsible for sponsoring this particular piece of art, but the original work was provided or was produced by a fellow named Pat Mavenko Smith. And whoever this person was thought it would be meaningful to take simply a reproduction of that and put it on the side of this building. Mr. Smith was attempting to combine two descriptions of Jesus that we find in the book of Revelation. I'm no art critic, so I'm not telling you if this is great art or not. Some of you in this room probably have a much better idea about that than I do. But he was trying to do this. He was trying to take those two descriptions of Christ that we find in Revelation, one in chapter 1 that we just reviewed, one in chapter 19, which is clearly connected to it, forming something like bookends in Revelation, forming a context within which we're going to learn something about Jesus Christ, because the book is, after all, entitled The Revelation of Jesus Christ. And he tries to combine the imagery in those two, and this is what he came up with. His head and his hair are white like wool, as white as snow. His eyes are like blazing fire. His feet are like bronze glowing in a furnace. His voice is like the sound of rushing water. Out of his mouth comes a sharp sword. His face is like the sun, shining in all its brilliance. Of course, you know in chapter 19 we have the horse included, so hence that is included there as well. I suspect that if I could ask the same question to you about the fundamental descriptive adjective that would probably be most important with respect to a description of God throughout the Scripture, we might come up with some of the same words that we were suggesting a moment ago. What would it be? What would be the central word if we had to reduce it to one thing? Some of your minds may go to Isaiah chapter 6. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne, high and lifted up. The train of his robe filled the temple. Seraphim stood above him, each having 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, with 2 he covered his feet, with 2 he flew. One called out to the other and said, what? Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. This is, by the way, my church. It was built in about 1910. It's one of the great downtown structures there in Spokane. I've been there for many years. I taught for some years a class that was called the Communicants class. Sorry, my clicker's going the wrong way. Over-eager. Communicants class, as you may know, is a course that was offered kind of a simplified systematic theology for young people in their late junior high or high school, early high school years. preparing them to become full members of the church, to stand up in front of the congregation, to own their faith, and so on. As part of that course, I would take the kids on a little bit of a tour of this magnificent building. And one of the stops we would make along the way, is you can hardly see it here because it would be at night, and this is kind of a nighttime image of the sanctuary. This course would take place in the evening. There'd be nobody there. And I'd say to the kids as we're about to go into the sanctuary, okay, you guys, I want you to just not so much look at this room, but I want you to feel this room. Just be quiet and let's just kind of walk into this space and experience it. And so we'd go down the central aisle, actually. The place is empty, the lights are low. Sit down on the front row. Maybe for a couple of minutes, I just let them sit there in silence. Then I ask the question, so what do you think? What are you feeling? My favorite answer was one young man who said, quote, "It's kind of spooky." Kind of spooky. I think he wanted to say something else, but he didn't quite have the vocabulary at his disposal to really articulate quite what he wanted to say, because it was something more or different than simply being spooky. But that was the best he could come up with at the time. It may have been that he was prompted in that opinion by something you cannot see in this slide, but is located where the white circle is, right at the base of the pipes of the pipe organ. And if I blew that up a little bit, I hope you can read that. It's a plaque, and it says, "Holy, holy, holy." A little reminder to everybody as they come into this space that we are coming, after all, into what is commonly called the sanctuary, the sanctum, the place where there's a distinct recognition that God is holy. And I would submit to you, and I hope most of you would probably have already given the answer, that if we had to ask the question, what's the most fundamental term that's used in the Bible to give us a sense of who God is and what He is, we would say He is holy, holy, holy. That phrase has been viewed as so important that it's actually been given a technical term, the term trace hagion. Trace hagion literally means 3 times holy. The reason it's been viewed as so important is because it represents a certain distinct literary structure of the Hebrew language. Some of you read Hebrew, I know, and so you'll be familiar with this. If you read the Old Testament in Hebrew, you'll find that occasionally words will be repeated. Usually it's not translated because it doesn't make good English. In English, we have other ways to emphasize a word. We can underscore, italicize, capitalize, do various things that our technology allows us to do. But in ancient Hebrew, if they wanted to emphasize a word, they would simply repeat it. A young Jewish man wants to write a letter to his girlfriend, communicate his affection. He might say, "I love you." But if he really wanted to drive the point home, he might say to her, "I love you." Or he might say, "I love you, you know." And that would be very common. Emphasis. In the Old Testament and in the Hebrew language, occasionally, a word would be elevated to the point where you might say, you should view this word as having no greater possible emphasis. It's being elevated to the highest level of importance. And in that case, the word would not simply be repeated, it'd be repeated twice. That is to say, it would be stated 3 times. And of course, as you're well aware, there's no word in the Bible describing God that is ever treated that way. It's only said of Him that He's holy, holy, holy. That has been so deeply inscribed in the Christian DNA that I think you'll agree with me, it virtually shows up at every corner in our Christian parlance. Some of you brought a book to this gathering, and you would call it what? the Holy Bible. We don't call it the joyful Bible, the loving Bible, the peaceful Bible, the righteous. We call it the Holy Bible. If I said, hey everybody, I'm going to take you on a field trip tomorrow to the Holy Land, where do you suppose we're going? Las Vegas? Atlantic City? You all know where the Holy Land is, and you know that in the midst of the Holy Land is a city that was called the what? Holy City. And if we were living in the ancient world and went to the Holy City, we'd be looking for a place that was called the Holy Place. And in the conception of the presence of God in this world, the ancient Jewish people believed the most concentrated expression of that presence was in a little cubicle inside that called the Holy of Holies. And there was holy time. If we're going to worship God, it's a holy festival or it's a holy Sabbath. And of course, maybe most importantly, the continual command, you shall be holy, for I am holy. I think we all have an intuition that there is some kind of feeling state that is aroused by the presence of the holy. It's what my young friend was groping for when he used the word spooky, but there may be better words at our disposal. C.S. Lewis, in his classic little volume, The Problem of Pain, which I heartily recommend. And by the way, if you don't remember a thing that I say, which is very probable, then I hope you'll at least make a note of the books I recommend. They are worth the price of admission, at least as far as my part of this is concerned. And so, the first of these is this book by C.S. Lewis. If you have not read it, you should, especially you who are in pastoral ministry or otherwise engaged in dealing with people who are going through painful circumstances. Lewis treats the problem of pain. And in this first chapter of that book, he gives a most interesting kind of thought exercise. And I hope my eyes are good enough to read it. It's actually better up here. I'll see how I do. I'm going to do it this way. Is that okay? So this is C.S. Lewis in the first chapter of this book. In all developed religion, we find three strands or elements, and in Christianity, one more. The first of these is what Professor Otto calls the experience of the numinous. Those who have not met this term may be introduced to it by the following device. Suppose you were told there was a tiger in the next room. You would probably feel fear. But if you were told there's a ghost in the next room and you believed it, you would feel indeed what is often called fear, but of a different kind. It would not be based on the knowledge of danger, for no one is primarily afraid of what a ghost may do to him, but of the mere fact that it is a ghost. It is uncanny rather than dangerous. And the special kind of fear it excites may be called dread. With the uncanny, one has reached the fringes of the numinous. Now suppose that you were told simply, there's a mighty spirit in the room, and you believed it. Your feelings would then be less like the fear of danger, but the disturbance would be profound. You would feel wonder and a certain shrinking, a sense of inadequacy to cope with such a visitant, and prostration before it. An emotion which might be expressed in Shakespeare's words, quote, under it my genius is rebuked. This feeling may be described as awe, and the object which excites it, the numinous. In that paragraph, C.S. Lewis mentions a fellow that he doesn't even identify in a footnote, because when he wrote it, the name was so commonly known he didn't need to say anything further about it. Unfortunately, we've sort of lost track of this particular work, but it's Professor Rudolf Otto that he's referring to in a book that he wrote around the turn of the 20th century entitled The Idea of the Holy. Now, I said I'm going to make book recommendations, but in each of my presentations, there's one in particular that I'm going to kind of really push. So this is the first one. Das Heilige was the original title of this book, written in German by Rudolf Otto. It was translated into English some years later under the title, The Idea of the Holy. And in this book, he explores this distinct understanding of the notion of the sacred in human experience. He begins by, of course, as you would expect, an analysis of the word itself, the Hebrew word Qadesh, which comes from an ancient Semitic root, which means to divide or to separate. Out of that, the idea of something being set apart or other. But then Otto goes into a much more detailed examination of the word. He says, in a sense, our understanding of the holy can be divided into two different layers. There's this lower level, you might say, which he describes as moral goodness. Well, if you say somebody is holy, then of course, part of what we understand in that is this person has moral virtue. But then he says, aside from that, there is this kind of mysterious additional quality, which is not quite so easy to wrap words around. But we all have a sense of it. We all have a feeling connected to this. And this is what Otto called the numinous that C.S. Lewis referred to. This is something that cannot be precisely defined. But it's necessary. It's something notwithstanding that we kind of have an intuition about. Otto says, I shall speak then of a unique numinous category of value and of a definitely numinous state of mind, which is always present whenever the category is applied. This mental state is perfectly sui generis and irreducible to any other, and therefore, like every absolutely primary and elementary datum, while it admits of being discussed, it cannot be strictly defined. Every one of you in this room has some sense of what this is. And yet we all, I think, would agree that our attempts to describe it in words would be difficult at best. However, Rudolf says even though the numinous is difficult to describe, it is possible to wrap words around that emotion that we feel. And what Otto coined as a term that became classic in theological usage is the little phrase, Mysterium Tremendum. Maybe you've heard that. Mysterium Tremendum. This is an emotion. It is a peculiarly distinct human emotion aroused only in the presence of that which is perceived to be holy. And this is really where he spends the lion's share of his effort in this book. The experience of the Mysterium Tremendum is something you'll find scattered through the Scriptures. If you're looking for it, it shows up virtually on every page. Hints of it are there. I just gave you chapter 1 of John's Apocalypse. John sees this vision of Christ, and what does he do? He doesn't say, oh, hey, Jesus, nice to see you again. It's been a while, pal. You know, remember that time we were at the Last Supper, and that was a nice time. Oh, what does John? He falls on his face as though dead. Isaiah, there in the temple in chapter 6, as he's being commissioned to be a prophet to Israel, sees the Lord, holy, holy, holy. What's his response? Woe is me. I'm undone. I'm a man of unclean lips. I tell you, that man Isaiah had never spoken one word that would blaspheme or take in vain the name of his Lord since the day he was born. But now he feels he's a man of unclean lips. He dwells among a people of unclean lips. Why does he feel that way? Because my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. If you read theological contributions throughout history, you'll find that virtually every theologian worth his or her salt has addressed this issue. Augustine described it. Thomas Aquinas described it. The Reformers all refer to this. The Puritans had a lot to say about it, and many others. One of my favorites Comes from Calvin, the first couple of chapters in his Institutes. He gives this language. Listen to these words. Hence that dread and amazement with which Scripture uniformly relates holy men were struck and overwhelmed whenever they beheld the presence of God. When we see those who previously stood firm and secure, so quaking with terror that the fear of death takes hold of them. Nay, they are in a manner swallowed up and annihilated. The inference to be drawn is that men are never duly touched and impressed with a conviction of their insignificance until they have contrasted themselves with the majesty of God. Frequent examples of this consternation occur both in the book of Judges and the prophetical writings, so much so that it was a common expression among the people of God, quote, "We shall die, for we have seen the Lord." Hence the book of Job, also in humbling men under a conviction of their folly, feebleness, and pollution, always derives its chief argument from descriptions of the divine wisdom, virtue, and purity, nor without cause. For we see Abraham the readier to acknowledge himself but dust and ashes, the nearer he applies to behold the glory of the Lord. And Elijah, unable to wait with unveiled face for his approach, so dreadful is the sight. And what can man do? Man who is but rottenness and a worm, when even the cherubim themselves must veil their faces in very terror. To this undoubtedly the prophet Isaiah refers when he says, "The moon shall be confounded, the sun ashamed, when the Lord of hosts shall reign." That is, when he shall exhibit his refulgence and give a nearer view of it. The brightest objects will, in comparison, be covered with darkness. Just one typical example of how those who have considered this try to express that feeling that is aroused in the presence of a holy God. The term that Otto gives us, Mysterium, Tremendum, he treats each term separately. They were carefully chosen. The word Tremendum has three subcomponents to it. The first of which he calls the awfulness of God. He says that when we experience the holy, it plunges us into a state of stupefied wonder. He says the most common physiological expression of that is trembling. Hence the word tremendum. And he notes how frequently there are reports of people in a true state of worship trembling. I was just reading this morning, as it turns out, the text in 1 Samuel, in which Samuel is going to the town of Bethlehem. He's going to anoint one of the sons of Jesse. He doesn't know which one yet, as you know. And we hear that the elders of the town of Bethlehem came out to meet Samuel trembling at the presence of this holy man. Some of you know the prophet Habakkuk, that complaining prophet who in the year 608 or so, shaken by the recent death of King Josiah, the good king, who in a kind of moment of misguided judgment went out and confronted Pharaoh Necho on the field of battle at Megiddo, trying to prevent Necho from going up and rescuing the Assyrians in Carchemish. For Pete's sake, what did Josiah have to do with that? No dog in that fight, but there he is, fighting Necho. He's killed on the field of battle, and Habakkuk, tormented by what's just happened, begins to raise his complaining voice because he sees through his prophetic lens that God is going to raise up the Babylonians to be an instrument of chastisement against the people of God. And he says, how can you judge us using those less righteous than we? And you feel the kind of fury in his complaint until chapter 3 arrives, when God actually appears to Habakkuk. And then he says, when I heard, my body trembled. My lips quivered at the voice. Rottenness entered my bones. I trembled in myself. The people of God back in Exodus chapter 20 received the 10 Commandments. In the run-up to that, chapter 19, we hear the sound of the trumpet was very loud, so that all the people who heard it trembled. The psalmist, Psalm 119, my flesh trembles for fear of you. I'm afraid of your judgment. Psalm 114, tremble, O earth, at the presence of the Lord, at the presence of the God of Jacob. By the way, were you there when they crucified my Lord? Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Were you there? Sometimes it causes me to tremble. 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 The second element that Rudolf Otto mentions in connection with the holy is what he calls the overpoweringness of God. Now, you English teachers in the room know there is no such word, in the English language. But when you're translating from a language with the precision of German, you have to do a little inventing along the way, and so that's the word that they came up with. This was, as he describes it, the overwhelming sense when you are in the presence of the holy that you are but dust. When we look at the Old Testament, I think you know that there's a variety of names that are associated with God. Many of you could recite many of those names. There's one name in particular that has been especially tied to this idea of God being the overpowering one. It has its roots in an ancient Semitic phrase meaning to thunder. And it means literally the God who thunders, or the God who overpowers or overwhelms, or even in a more brash sense, the God who bullies. It's a powerful word suggesting God's absolutely uncontestable superiority and power to any of us. And the word is, I don't know if anyone can guess the name. Do you have an idea? El Shaddai. El Shaddai. It's interesting. There's one book in the Old Testament, many books use this name, but there's one book in particular that uses this name for God more virtually than all the rest of the Old Testament put together. Anyone want to take a guess? What do you suppose that book is? Anybody have a guess? The book of Job. The God who bullies. You, of course, know the story of Job. I don't need to remind you of it. Job was a righteous man. He's unimpeachable in his public conduct. He drives the speed limit, pays his taxes, takes care of his kids, is a generous man, well-respected, highly regarded, Job. And for reasons that are never made clear to him, his life is absolutely devastated. All of those, what seem to be the effects of a righteous life, are taken away from him. And he's left completely without anything that had once been his station in life. And three friends come and try to say to him, look, Job, let's get real. There's some secret sin here, buddy. You better spit it out. You better get it on the table. Let's talk about it. Maybe you can recover something. And of course, Job keeps protesting, doesn't he? What have I done? How come I've wound up in this situation? I don't deserve this. And he argues with his friends, but you feel as the story of the book unfolds, eventually he's not simply arguing with his friends, he's arguing with God. I want my day in court. I want to stand in the presence of God and make my case. You know that story. And for some 38 chapters, we hear this banter back and forth as Job continues to have a crescendo of rage within him, wanting to confront the deity and ask, what's up? And then finally, chapter 38, what do you know? God shows up. Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Okay. You want some time in the ring? Prepare yourself like a man. Read, put up your dukes. I'll question you. You answer me. It's almost like you can read between the lines. God is saying, I've been up in heaven in perfect bliss of deity, and I keep hearing this grating sound down there, on this sound like fingers on a chalkboard. I just thought I'd come down and find out who's making the racket down here. Is that you, Job? Is that you darkening counsel by words that are void of knowledge? Is that you? Okay, you want your day in court? You want to confront my wisdom? Fine. Let's get at it. I practiced law for about 20 years. I practiced a kind of law called litigation. Litigation is basically trial and pretrial work. So I would prepare for and do trials. And of course, the heart of the matter was, as one law professor said in class one day, the heart of the matter is cross-examination. This individual said, the test of a trial lawyer is how effectively can you cross-examine a hostile witness. That's what it's all about. And I took that to heart, and I did quite a few cross-examinations over the years. Some went well, some not so much. But, I did my best. But I'm going to suggest to you this hypothesis. I don't think anybody in the history of the planet has ever been cross-examined as viciously as Job the day he got in the ring with El Shaddai. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you're so smart. Who determined its measurement? Surely you got to know. Who stretched the line upon it? To what were its foundations fastened? Who laid the cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy? It's like God is saying, Job, I think I remember that day when by the mere power of my word I spoke the universe into existence. I think I recall that moment when all of the sons of God shouted for joy at the beauty and the splendor of what was before their eyes. The only thing I don't recall, Job, is you being there. I don't know how I pulled it off without you. Where were you? And there's no letting up. You've read it. You've all read Job, haven't you? Many times. 2 full chapters of question after question after question. Waves of devastating, overwhelming, irresistible, powerful questions. We wind up with this from God. Moreover, the Lord answered Job and said, shall the one who contends with El Shaddai correct him? He who rebukes God. Answer it. Well, now, wait a minute. Job was the one who was just saying a few chapters ago, I want my day in court. What is he saying now? Well, look, now, God, you've made a pretty good case here. I have to say you scored a couple of points, but I've still got some things I want to say. No. Then Job answered the Lord and said, behold, I am vile. What shall I answer you? I lay my hand over my mouth. Once I spoke, but I will not answer. Twice, but I'll proceed no further. What do we expect? We expect God to say, okay, fine, Job, that's good. I'm glad you got the point. No, back to business. No. Then there's 2 more chapters. We're not done with you yet. And for another tirade of avalanche questions, Job is just reduced to nothing. This righteous man has been brought to his knees before El Shaddai. I've heard of you by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you, therefore I abhor myself. I repent in dust and ashes. I'm going to tell you something. Compared to how Job felt at this moment, he thought he was doing pretty good before God showed up, when he was only devastated by the vagaries of life. The third of the elements that Otto mentions is what he calls the energy of God, or another word might be the urgency of God. The idea of this word is that when you encounter the holy, it's not that you're just encountering something that's on the order of a vast and awesome experience, but it doesn't pose any immediate threat to your well-being, like looking at the Grand Canyon. You know, it's an awesome thing, but it's not like you feel like it's going to attack you at any moment. You just sort of observe it and you're moved by it. You encounter a sleeping giant. Well, it's awesome, it's frightening, but you know that if you're circumspect, if you tiptoe lightly, you could probably escape without any harm to your well-being. Just don't wake this giant up. No, when you encounter the holy, Otto says, you discover that you are discovered. Or in the language of the author of the Hebrews, to the letter to the Hebrews, we are stripped and laid bare. There are no secrets. The white, hot, examining gaze of the Holy One sees the innermost content of our hearts, and it is exposed in technicolor, and there is no place to hide. Now, I'm just going to be honest with you. You know, most of us are thinking, well, if that's the experience of the holy, where's the exit? You know, this is traumatic in the extreme, and you don't know why anybody would remain in the presence of such a one. But then Otto adds this other component, what he calls the Mysterium. And by this he means something of the, what he calls fascination. He says that even though we are traumatized by this one who is holy, nevertheless somehow we are drawn, he says, allured with a potent charm, and we just can't quite tear ourselves away. We want to run, but we want to stay. And it creates the deep, maybe most profound experience of human ambivalence. It is the heart of worship. Worship is when you are in the presence of one that causes you to tremble, and yet one with whom you experience such fascination that you can't pull your eyes away. Worship is the experience of the presence of the one who both terrifies and fascinates. Otto says, these two qualities, the daunting and the fascinating, now combine in a strange harmony of contrasts. And the resultant dual character of the numinous consciousness, at any rate from the level of the demonic dread onwards, is at once the strangest and most noteworthy phenomenon in the whole history of religion. And let me drop a little footnote in here. It may seem odd that he would use the term demonic, divine. But Otto makes the case, and it's worth reviewing, that this sense of the holy, while it reaches its richest and most deep and powerful expression in the biblical understanding of worship, and especially in the Christian understanding of it, Otto says at the same time, there is something of this recognition of the holy in every human being. This is not something that is a peculiarly Christian experience. We have a deeper understanding of it, hopefully, but you can go to the most primitive civilization and people still have a sense of the holy. And he notices that, and he comments on it. And so, probably as a result of general revelation, certainly compatible with what Paul says in Romans chapters 1 and 2, you can find this sense of Mysterium, Tremendum elsewhere. But for us who are worshiping the true God through Christ, this is an insight we need to be thinking about. Otto continues, the demonic divine object may appear to the mind an object of horror and dread, but at the same time it is no less something that allures with a potent charm. And the creature who trembles before it, utterly cowed and cast down, has always at the same time the impulse to turn to it, nay, even somehow to make it his own. He says the mystery is for him not merely something to be wondered at, but something that entrances him, and beside that in which bewilders and confounds, he feels a something that captivates and transports him with a strange ravishment, rising often enough to the pitch of dizzy intoxication. It is the Dionysiac element of the numen. Some of you may know the name of Reginald Huber. Reginald Huber, sorry. He was born in 1783, England, brilliant student at Oxford, training to go into the ministry in the Anglican Church as a priest. He was a typical product of the Enlightenment that had seized English religion during those days, late 1700s, quite liberal, viewing God as just one of many approaches to deity. He took a tour around really during the Napoleonic Wars, came in contact with Islamic folks. He wrote rather favorably about them and others. Returned to England, was eventually ordained an Anglican priest. However, as he began his career in this rather prestigious role, he found himself, first of all, irritated, then interested, and later fascinated by some phenomenon that was sweeping through the lower classes in England by another Anglican priest, a guy by the name of John Wesley. Wesley was preaching in a way that was unprecedented. He was preaching outside. He was not preaching to the polite folks of English society. He was preaching to people who were working in the dregs of the Industrial Revolution as virtual slaves, working the mines, working the mills, scraping by on the most impoverished of circumstances. And he began to see the power of Wesley's preaching. We don't know exactly quite how it happened, but at some point or other, apparently in connection with another man who was touched by Wesley's ministry, a guy by the name of John Newton, who had been a slave trader, turned Christian, turned hymn writer. Somehow that hymn, Amazing Grace, touched Reginald Huber. And he had a transforming experience that led him to follow William Carey, sometimes called the father of the modern missionary movement, to India. Reginald Huber left the Anglican priest position that he had with all of its lovely accoutrements and perks, and went off where he died at age 43 in India. Before he left, he wrote a hymn that somehow captured something of what he discovered in that moment. You may recognize it. It goes like this: Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, early in the morning my song will rise to thee. Holy, 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 merciful and mighty, God in three persons, blessed Trinity. Holy, 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 all the saints adore thee. casting down their golden crowns around the glassy sea, cherubim and seraphim, falling down before thee, which wert and art, and evermore shall be. Holy, holy, holy. Though the darkness hide thee, though the eye of sinful man thy glory may not see, only thou art holy. There is none beside thee, perfect in power, in love and purity. Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty. All thy works shall praise thy name in earth and sky and sea. Holy, 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 merciful and mighty, God in three persons. Blessed Trinity. Amen.